Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for Bloomreach's Commerce Pulse Quarterly Roundtable. My name is Michelle DeMeo, and I'll be hosting our event today. I will be joined by my colleague, Ian Burgers, as well as our two panelists, Paul DeForno, Managing Director of Commerce and Content Practice at Deloitte Digital, and Brian Walker, Chief Strategy Officer here at Bloomreach. Commerce Pulse, for those of you joining us for the first time here, is a quarterly event that highlights the data we've gathered at Bloomreach. Our digital experience platform powers commerce experiences for hundreds of brands and retailers around the world. And so our insights paint a very comprehensive picture of the state of commerce, where it is today and where it's going in the months ahead. Over the past few months, we've been tracking patterns and trends in e-commerce, which have been detailed in our monthly Commerce Pulse blog posts. You can find all of those on our website, bloomreach.com. Today, we'll talk about those insights at a high level, what these past few months have meant for e-commerce, and what it means for the future. We'll then break that down into three sections, a general overview of the impact of COVID on e-commerce, and then we'll do a deep dive into apparel as well as B2B. So with that said, we will go ahead and kick things off. I'm going to pass it over to Ian, who will share some key data points about the overall trends we've seen this past quarter. Ian?
Thanks, Michelle. So let's take a look at the overall year-over-year data. And then we can immediately see that in North America, the numbers are really high. We can see a 51.17% year-over-year sales increase and a 60.66% overall traffic increase year-over-year for North America. The numbers for the UK and the EU are a bit lower. We see a 17.49% year-over-year sales increase there, and still a pretty impressive 42.19% overall traffic increase. Now, if we add those numbers up, we end up with a 32.64% overall sales increase and a little over 57% overall traffic increase. Now let's take a look at the search term data. And to give a little bit of context, we are talking about on-site searches here. And when we compare the April 2021 top search terms with the April 2020 top search terms, we can see a really interesting trend. In April 2020, we can see that the pandemic is really top of mind for consumers. People are searching for toilet paper, paper towels, and masks. All the top search terms are related to COVID-19. But a year later, in April 2021, we can see a real shift in how consumers shop online. They're buying their normal things again, and people are shopping for clothing like dresses and shorts. They're doing their groceries and they're searching for milk and water. And we can even see a luxury search term here, Tory Burch, which is suggesting that people are, spending a bit of their money again online. Back to you, Michelle.
That's great. Thank you, Ian. So Brian, Paul, with this data in mind that Ian just shared, let's maybe just start with some general thoughts about what this past year has meant for e-commerce. Paul, consumer habits have clearly changed during the pandemic. Can you share some of the key highlights your clients saw, how those changes may continue as we emerge from the pandemic and really start to reopen in a lot of markets?
Well, one thing for sure that you see, and if you drill down even lower in some of the terms and compare it to the year before, you see this terms around food. If one thing for sure that you've seen the biggest impact over the long term is going to be in the food category. And what really took that COVID to happen, to have people try to order food, many people got over that hump. And in fact, some of the data and some of the research that we saw were, the biggest growth area was actually baby boomers and senior citizens in ordering online. And they got used to it. And once you get used to it, you keep doing it. Now, will they do it at the same? Probably not. But if you also look at how the future of work is going to be, and now that you're for sure going to be spending probably more time at home, all that ordering online and food related products, both directly as groceries, but also into restaurants, delivery system, food plans, all of the food category areas is definitely one impact that, post this COVID is going to be a massive change. And I think on the other side that we're starting to see now that there, for a long period, there was an impact of not clear how overall businesses would work. But clearly, as we dig into some of the impacts that from a segment perspective, the top 10% of people actually saved way more money than they would have in normal years in doing travel, etc. So there's been a spike in luxury. So I think what you're going to see, especially over this short term to medium term, is a spike in buying in the luxury items, as you saw into a couple of your terms.
Yeah, absolutely. Myself included in that luxury boom. Brian, I think another really interesting point that Ian went over was the disparity between the US and Europe. I mean, we saw really significant increases in the US, almost 50% sales increase year over year, but that was only at about 18% in Europe. Why do you think that is?
I think that's tied more to macroeconomic factors and really a different sort of policy response to the pandemic and the economic situation between the U.S. and Europe and the U.K. The U.K. was also going through a lot of uncertainty related to Brexit a year ago as well. So, certainly people, turned to online and sort of a digital first shopping strategy for necessities as well as, discretionary purchasing. But it was still tied to kind of their feelings about the overall economy, their confidence in the economy and the economic recovery. Differences between the policy response, again, where in the US it was direct stimulus to consumers, many of whom put that money either into consumption or investment, whereas in Europe it was more around employment security and sort of having people not go to work, but just continuing to pay their salaries through their companies, through their employers, but often at an 80% rate. And as a result of that, consumers naturally pulled back. So even though we see an increase in online shopping as a result of the pandemic, it was moderated significantly by the macroeconomic and kind of social attitudes of the consumer.
Yeah. I would imagine also in a category like grocery, for example, and Paul kind of talked about the change in the populations using that, there is also the geographic differences in categories like this, where some areas may already be using that
That's
more
right.
in certain countries.
That is absolutely true. So like in the UK and in Northern Europe, online grocery was already, much more mature than in the US or North American markets. And as Paul said, not just in grocery, but across many different segments, consumers actually purchased online in categories that they'd never purchased before. Over half of American consumers purchased outside of categories that they'd never purchased before, for an example. So not just grocery, but in many others as well. And as parts of the population who hadn't been purchasing online in a significant amount, obviously were, again, both for necessities as well as discretionary spending. And of course, businesses adapted as well, both with delivery and curbside pickup in order to facilitate that. And that's what I think we're all waiting to see, right? How does that behavior adapt as some of these markets now emerge from the pandemic and consumers begin to return, in some cases enthusiastically return, to pre-pandemic behaviors, and in some cases cautiously return to pre-pandemic behaviors. And again, there's sort of a demographic change. Older consumers, may feel a little more cautious about returning, and younger consumers may be more enthusiastically returning. I mean, that's a gross generalization, but I think that's understandable. And certainly, in certain categories, as Paul also shared, we'll see consumption and sort of interest in categories spike, and in other cases moderate. I think it'll be very interesting to see in categories like home home improvement as well as home furnishings and kitchen and so forth, where we saw a tremendous increase during the pandemic. Some of those categories north of 100% growth year over year during the pandemic. We still see this not only, interest in working remote, working from home, or some hybrid strategy in a lot of markets, but a lot of consumers have also really kind of embraced nesting. I was just reading actually this morning that pre-pandemic spending on home furnishings and home improvement was actually dropping pretty significantly because consumers were out and about, they were traveling a lot, they were not investing in their home. And of course, we saw that change due to the pandemic. Now it'll be interesting to see what happens next in some of those segments, right? Now that we emerge.
Yeah. Well, this is a great segue because talking about segments that have been drastically impacted by COVID, I think apparel is really at the top. I know certainly my wardrobe changed quite a bit during the pandemic, and I think that was pretty broadly felt. So I'd love to drill down a little bit more into that. Ian, can you go ahead and share some of the big trends and patterns we saw in the apparel category?
Definitely. Let's get into some of that apparel data because I think it shows a really interesting story. So if we compare May 2021 to May 2020, we can see that there was an overall sales decrease for the apparel category by 21.81%. And we think that is likely due to a really sharp increase in online shopping because of stay-at-home policies and in-store shopping restrictions that were very of effect in 2020. Now, it's not all bad. We can see that in May 2021, compared to April 2021, there is a sales increase of 3.2%, which is really showing that people are getting together their wardrobe for a vaccinated summer. Now, in 2020, most of us had to spend a lot of our time at home, and we really prioritized comfortable clothing. And that is also what we see in the data here. Joggers and leggings saw a 9% month-over-month conversion rate increase, and on average, a 11% month-over-month revenue increase. Now, that's nothing compared to sweatpants and pajamas, which saw an average of a 30% growth for conversion rate and an average 36% month-over-month growth for revenue. But where people really prioritized comfortable clothing in 2020, we can see that that's changing in 2021. So here in 2021, we can see that all casual clothing groups are decreasing in conversion rate and revenue. And in March 2021, we can already see that outdoor clothing, like dresses and jumpsuits, are taking the lead and seeing a steep increase in sales. Back to you, Michelle.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ian. Clearly a lot of fluctuation going on. Casual categories gaining very big at the onset of COVID, of course. Now outdoor clothing starting to see those returns. So Paul, where do you think apparel goes from here? At what point do you think we're going to see things start to level out around the different categories? And do you think this is going to impact the types of categories and just kind of the apparel strategy for retailers and brands going forward?
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit more color to those numbers and maybe some other numbers to give a little bit more context. So with the apparel going down 20%, you can understand that, especially in the US, because you look back a year and May might have been the biggest shutdown period across the board in the US. And on the other side, here in May of June 21, the US Census Bureau actually came out and said the apparel clothing category actually grew at retail stores at over 200%. So you can imagine that it'd be hard to draw any conclusions there other than people are just excited to get out, right? And so you have this phenomenon of, I can go out and shop and it's great compared to last year. I'm locked in my house and I have no other option than buy sweats online. So May probably is not going to be your consistent month, but I think what you're going to find, and is some clues in your data, is that your search numbers are higher. And so people, no matter what, are going to be looking online and doing that search and maybe doing some investigation. But retail isn't dead. People want to get out. They want to feel and touch, especially apparel and clothing. And so part of what you need to look at, and especially as we work with our retail customers, is that what is that mix of retail, online, and how do you make that excitement of being online and touching the product? And so I don't think there is going to be any general things that you can call just from May, but for sure there's going to be some segments, especially as you look to what are the macro trends that are happening. So if we go back to now thinking about that, work from home is going to be such a big change in remote work. You're not going to see the same purchases of formal clothes, of blazers, of ties on men, and formal dress, right? So for sure you're going to see those types of segment changes and much more of leisure wear. In fact, there's even I believe there's some D2C retailers out there that are selling suits that are in the same clothing as your jogging pants, right? So some kind of mixed leisure wear. So look for some new interesting ways, but it's definitely, especially the segments that are, the Brooks Brothers like stores are going to be on the wane versus, more of Lululemon moving into areas where they're getting much more aligned with the leisure set and working from home.
I never thought I'd hear Paul DeForno giving fashion forecasts.
I just won't stand up above this area here.
I think it, as Paul said, I think it's really important that we remember that the consumer today is digital first. So even if they're not converting online at the same rate they were a year ago, and we can see that dip month over month, traffic is up, right? Consumers are getting their clues through a variety of different means, including social media, through marketing, through journalism, and so forth that they're consuming, but also, of course, more and more consumers. 70% of consumers now are going to go to a manufacturer's brand website directly in their research and consideration around what to buy. So you just got to recognize that just counting the receipts at the end of the day, and kind of trying to parse out what's happening could lead you to a slightly wrong conclusion about the role of your online and digital channels if you're just looking at that data that Ian reflected. I think it's also just really important that we recognize a couple of other macro factors that don't just affect apparel, but certainly do. We're not returning to the office at the same rate. People don't commute in the same ways. We're not yet returning to really the kind of leisure travel that many would do to go to shopping hubs, if you will, like New York City or others like Milan, right, to do their shopping. So the patterns of our lives, especially our day-to-day lives, still are not really where we're out and about and running errands at lunchtime or stopping by the mall on the way home. And the digital channels are going to remain just primary convenience for consumers who are trying to fill out a list, whether it's a back-to-school shopping list or necessities. Now, I do think right now, as Paul said, many consumers actually do want to get out. It's refreshing, right? It's uplifting in a way, and there's an aspect of entertainment with shopping for many people, but that is not necessarily sustainable, and that's a periodic thing that we as consumers may do, but it doesn't really fill in the day-to-day consumption for either necessities or consumables, fashion, and so forth. And so we have to be really careful right now not to read too much into the to the short-term number and look for a longer-term pattern. And I think the longer-term pattern is very, very clear here. That's what we have to wait and see, though, how the numbers play out.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, maybe the flip side of this, you've both kind of talked about this digital first strategy that retailers are going to be needing to lead with, but there are also those gaps on the physical side now that they have to consider and sort of fill in, which we saw a lot of throughout the pandemic. You know, I think you referenced, Brian, curbside pickup, and we saw the rise of a lot of these unique ways to be utilizing the store to really bridge the digital and the physical and create greater value for the customer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I also think that especially, but not exclusively, but especially many women who now may be looking to refresh their wardrobes, professional women who, you know, they want to look contemporary and fresh, and they're in a sense looking back at their closets that are now 18 months old and not feeling very inspired. That's true also of me. It's not just certainly not exclusive, but we'll see now more and more women, I think, trying out online ordering where they can try out various sizes at home. They've been doing that now for a while as they look to refresh their wardrobes. That's certainly going to be something we're going to continue to see, I think, grow. Many people, but especially women, feel more comfortable trying on clothes in the privacy of their own home versus a dressing room and out and about and so forth. And then, of course, services that are subscription based and where there's a fashion advisory component to that, whether it's enhanced through AI or also curated by human stylists. You can see that more and more consumers are also gravitating toward that, especially for professional apparel, where they kind of want to have their own style, but also kind of fit into the work environment. And so I think that's another trend that's going to play out here, and much of that is digital first. So we'll see how that also impacts the post-pandemic apparel market.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so now I want to switch gears a bit, drill down into a sector that I think is often overlooked in the COVID impact conversations, and that would be B2B. So Ian, can you share some of the data points here?
Definitely. Let's get into some of the B2B data. So B2B was heavily impacted by the pandemic in 2020. And while we're seeing some positive effects of the vaccination ramp up and the slow reopening for B2C, we're not necessarily seeing the same impact for the B2B segment. Now, we do see a positive sales trend going on. When we compare April 2021 data to the year before, we see that there was a 44% sales decrease. But in May, there was a 14% year-over-year sales decrease. So there's definitely a positive sales trend going on there. We don't see the same numbers for overall site traffic though. There we see that site traffic was up 3% year-over-year in April, but was again down 6% year-over-year in May. Now we also took a look at the personal protective equipment, and those are items like gloves and masks. We see a really strong increase of decrease of 93% in May year-over-year, which is really showing that a lot of countries are having less problems with the pandemic. Now, packaging material sales were up with 40% May year-over-year, which includes items like shipping labels, cartons, and pallets. And one more really interesting data point that we found is that break room supplies are up for sales 22% year-over-year, which is really showing that people are going back to the office. I'm really interested in what Paul and Brian have to say about these numbers.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, clearly a lot to unpack here, no pun intended. B2B, B2C on very different paths. Sales trends, especially much different when you consider coming out of the pandemic. But despite those increases, Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on why that's not necessarily indicative of a larger negative trend in B2B.
Yeah. First of all, I think one of the biggest challenges, just to get a sense of B2B, the B2B market is actually much bigger than the whole B2C, and it's massive, and it's highly variable by different industry. And so the challenge in maybe some of the data is segmented to maybe distributors and suppliers in one area, but you have other areas such as healthcare that the B2B spiked massively. So I think the numbers that you guys have shared are, I think, very indicative of a couple of areas around some suppliers that provide different businesses, and when you looked at the PPE, you actually see that's a massive impact. And so if you look at the mix of like PPE was a massive seller for some of these B2B sellers a year ago, and now it's gone, you can see the delta. So that sometimes it's skewing maybe some of the overarching trends. And what I've seen, a couple of things just in general. Overall, there's a supply chain challenge, right? Right now, there's chips that are causing everything from cars to electronics that are slowing some of the sales to go out. So that's, one thing. But in different segments, like I said, healthcare, we've seen an unbelievable increase in the amount of ordering being done business to business. So all things around supporting the hospital supply chain, that B2B increased, massively. And then, finally in the B2B space, part of what we've also saw is a year ago this time, as many companies were super conservative, many of these companies pulled back some of their investments in the technology for B2B. And what we've seen, and the B2B companies, they're probably the laggards on doing some of these investments. And what we saw by the end of the year into the beginning of this year was a massive spike. So we've had the most number of B2B projects start in the last 4 months than we've ever seen. And so we anticipate much more B2B sales coming online in the next 6 to 12 months.
I'd also say that you cannot separate, again, what's happening in the macro economy from what's happening in online versus offline sales. So certainly the shutdown of schools, of entertainment venues, of offices, had a pretty profound impact in a couple of different market segments of B2B. And while there was demand for PPE, even a year ago there were supply chain constraints, and you saw the difference between traffic and sales growth a year ago. Traffic up massively, sales up, 30 to 40% year over year, but not commensurate with the traffic increase. And now we're seeing kind of a shift back. I think we're still not in many markets. When this data, came from, it's amazing how fast things are changing, even since that data was collected to where we are today recording this. But really, many markets, these same kinds of offline economy, parts of our business was not yet open, and so we still see that lagging effect on B2B demand. We also see supply chain issues, as Paul shared, I think also having an impact here, because we still see traffic up in certain markets, and obviously not down as far year over year, and yet sales are down, right? Which tells you that inventory availability is a challenge in products that the buyer, in the case of B2B, is looking for their facility. So there's a lot of different factors at weight here. I think, though, that if we look at how the buying behaviors are changing and the role of digital, again, there, the trend is still very, very clear that, again, we're moving toward essentially a digital first strategy, and the websites and apps that businesses are using to market their solutions and products. First and foremost, you've got to support an online research and consideration journey. And for most products, you're going to need to support an online conversion tied together with the customized pricing and terms and everything you've negotiated with the business the buyer works for. In high consideration purchases, that may move to an offline, so to speak, although it's online often through Zoom nowadays, but nonetheless, conversation to confirm a highly considered or negotiated purchase prior to the actual sales happening. Yet the impact of digital cannot be understated there. So similar in some ways to what we were saying about B2C, but obviously a very different dynamic. And again, I think it's hard to just take this slice of data, from April and May, and understand even where we're at as we record this in June, knowing that already things are changing very, very quickly in many of the markets those of you viewing are in.
And I would just add, I think to your point around, it's not just about the last purchase, especially in B2B, because it's such a complex sale. There's many people involved. There's many personas. A lot of what you're doing and giving tools for B2B, it's actually, how do you make it easier to do business with?
Frictionless.
That's really some of the benefits, and that doesn't always translate into the last revenue check, but the benefit to these digital tools, a lot of the business cases that we're driving with our customers, we're actually starting with our B2B implementations of first MVP. They don't even order, but being able to see the order status, being able to easily print their invoice, being able to bring that all together and being able to see the product info, they get a huge bump. And then later, as they get more comfortable, especially industrial buyers that aren't used to using some of these tools, that's where some of that value comes out. So you have to look at that whole journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just reiterating what has been kind of the thread throughout this whole conversation is this digital first strategy, regardless of industry and category. I mean, to really meet the customer where they are, particularly the customer that's changed throughout COVID, you really have to be creating that digital experience. Well, I've appreciated all of your insights in these kind of category specific topics, but as we start to wrap up, I want to just take a step back. We've talked a lot about this past quarter today, but Brian, as you said, things are changing very quickly, month to month, week to week. So I would love to end today by asking you both about what you see for the future. And, as we consider the few months ahead in the summer, do you have any broad predictions about what you see for digital? Paul, we can start with you.
Sure. So I think the first thing I'd like to start off with, because, I've been on this e-commerce journey for 20 years. And so I was always the guy, e-commerce, it's big. Trust me, it's coming along. It's going to be the thing. And then now I've got to the point, now I hear people saying e-commerce is everything. So I'm like, wait a minute, e-commerce is not everything. And now I have to guys, retail has come back. Retail's been around for thousands of years. It will always be there. You cannot replace walking into the shops and smelling the scents and touching and feeling. And so the challenge is, how do you change that experience when you're inside to give the power of the digital empowered, but also the benefit of being there? And so don't forget retail. Retail will always be there, but how do you make the experience better with digital?
Fully agree. I mean, look, I've also been on this e-commerce journey for over 20 years, and started out working for a vertically integrated retailer who had a lot of investment in stores and in the brand and in catalogs and all of that. And frankly, the principles have not changed. What has changed is the consumer behavior along the way. And it comes back to, again, not to sound like we're just harping on one sort of central idea, but it's hard to avoid, right? We just have to look at ourselves and those people around us, family members, friends. How are they going about making decisions about where to go, what to buy, what inspires them, right? We're all picking up our phones, we're all picking up our tablets, or jumping online through our computers, and it's just the way we behave now. And the pandemic just accelerated what was already a key trend there. So we just have to look at the behaviors. We have to just ground that in data to recognize the role of your digital channels, both in directly converting with customers, which is what we tend to think of when we think of e-commerce, but also in influencing sales across all of your channels or all of your distribution, if you're a wholesale brand. So the investment in that, you have to recognize that's going to be now the primary way you're going to inspire demand for what you're offering as a business or even an organization today. And those offline media channels that used to consume a lot of the advertising budget, radio, print, magazines, newspapers, the Sunday Circular, many of those businesses that grew up around those advertising vehicles or those marketing tools, we've seen, unfortunately, the results of that, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling spiral. And now a digitally native brand can launch, right, with online, storefronts that are relatively easy to spin up, infrastructure and technology costs that you can stitch together through SaaS, but even more importantly, driving demand through social media and direct marketing, and then really investing in retention. So once you've acquired a customer, actually very intentionally trying to develop a relationship with them to stimulate repurchase and to stimulate like a productive relationship. So it really has to be centered. Your marketing investments and your experience has to be centered around those digital channels first and foremost. But a couple other thoughts too on what to expect next. Revenge shopping. I think, what I mean by revenge is not revenge against other people, but revenge against COVID, revenge against lockdown, right? Maybe splurging a little bit. A lot of consumers did end up saving money, either intentionally or unintentionally, or, they got a stimulus check even and, parked it away or invested it or whatnot, right? Not to say that everybody, should have seen like a tremendous benefit, but many did. So there's pent up like demand in many markets, and that's true too in Europe, where consumers did pull back, but now, they're looking to maybe splurge a little bit, and some of that may be splurging on some travel, splurging on some restaurants and dining out and having some fun, but also you're going to want to look your best, and you might be kind of craving some luxury products, or maybe you're into now you're going to upgrade some of your consumer electronics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think revenge shopping is kind of a key trend right now. I do think that many consumers are going to look to do some travel, visiting family that they haven't seen in a year and a half, or taking that trip that was postponed due to COVID, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to spend money on that. We're also interested in kind of getting out and kind of breathing the air, smelling the smells and seeing the sights and feeling the environment around other people. And I think we're going to see some interesting temporary dips through the summertime of consumers really leaning in, right? Going back out to concerts, going back out to the big festivals and things like this that are going to happen. But I think we also will see this persistent long-term trend again to digital first. And then when we get back into the fall, the weather changes and we're kind of getting back into the swing of things with back to work and back to school and so forth, then we'll really be able to get a read on what is the post-pandemic kind of economy look like, and the role of digital and how it complements other channels and other experiences accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we look forward to seeing how these predictions pan out. We can circle back on our next Commerce Pulse Quarterly Roundtable, which will take place in September. So for everyone watching, there's a link to that on your webinar page if you'd like to sign up for the next webinar before you leave this one. And that link will also be included in the follow-up email sent to all of the participants after this webinar.
Wonderful.
So with that, I would like to thank you, Brian and Paul, very much for sharing all these great insights with us today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. You can learn more about Deloitte Digital's offerings by visiting their website. You can visit the Bloomreach blog to learn more about our Commerce Pulse data. And you can also visit our State of Commerce Experience website to download our recent report conducted by Forrester, which has some other really fascinating insights about the state of e-commerce today. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again next quarter. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.